In February 1936, a 74-year-old man walked into a bankruptcy court in New York and listed everything he owned, the clothes he was wearing. He valued them at $250. His debts came to nearly $1 million. The clerk who processed the filing had no reason to look twice at the name, because by 1936, the name had already slipped out of the newspapers, and the man himself had a way of smiling through procedures like this one, as if the paperwork concerned somebody else. But the name was William Crapo Durant, and the company he had personally assembled, piece by piece, in the space of about 20 months, was at that moment the largest industrial enterprise on the face of the earth. General Motors would sell more than 1.5 million vehicles that year. Its profits in 1936 alone were around $240 million, roughly 1,000 times the total worth of the man who had created it, as measured by the suit he stood up in. Nobody at General Motors owed him a cent, legally speaking. He had founded the company twice, lost it twice, and both times the men who took it from him used the same instrument to do it. Not fraud, not force, but arithmetic. This is the story of how the greatest company builder in American history ended up behind the counter of a bowling alley in the town he made rich, and why the arithmetic always wins. To understand what Durant built, start with what he walked away from. In the 1890s, Durant was already the richest kind of man a town like Flint, Michigan could produce. He had left school at 17, sold cigars, sold patent medicine, and then, in 1886, put $1,500 borrowed dollars into a small horse-drawn cart business. Within 15 years, the Durant Carriage Company was the largest carriage maker in the United States, turning out over 150,000 vehicles a year from 14 factories. Durant was worth perhaps $2 million, comfortable, established, and famously contemptuous of the new machines coughing their way down Flint streets. He called automobiles noisy, dangerous, smelly contraptions, and refused to let his daughter ride in one. The carriage trade was a business he understood completely. Buy the wheel maker, buy the axle maker, buy the varnish supplier, control every input, and price the finished article so a farmer could afford it. Hold that model in your mind, because Durant never had another idea as long as he lived. He simply applied that one idea, at increasing scale, to everything he touched. In 1904, the men who controlled the failing Buick Motor Company came to him, because their firm was drowning and Durant was the best salesman Michigan had ever seen. He took one Buick on a 2-month test through mud roads and ditches, and then did the thing he would keep doing for the next 30 years. He changed his mind completely in an afternoon and bet everything on the new position. What he did with Buick has few parallels in business history. In 1904, Buick had built a grand total of 37 cars. Durant took it over in November, and by 1908 Buick was the largest car maker in America, producing more cars than Ford and Cadillac combined. He did it with the carriage playbook, volume dealer networks he already knew from the wagon trade, and relentless personal salesmanship. At one New York auto show, he took orders for over 1,000 Buicks before the company had built 100, and then came the 20 months. On September 16, 1908, Durant incorporated a holding company in New Jersey with the deliberately bland name of General Motors, capitalized at $2,000. 12 days later, it owned Buick. Within a year and a half, it owned Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, which became Pontiac, and some 20 other car and parts firms. He bought Cadillac from the Leland family for $4.5 million, cash, giving them 10 days to think it over. They took it, and Cadillac repaid its purchase price in profits within about 18 months. And in 1909, Durant came within a signature of buying the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford said yes, for $8 million cash. Durant asked the bankers at J.P. Morgan for the loan. They turned him down, reportedly judging that neither Ford's company nor the automobile itself justified the price. $8 million for Ford, declined by men certain they understood risk better than the salesman from Flint. The first loss came almost immediately, and it set the pattern. Durant's method was to buy everything quickly, using stock rather than cash wherever possible, on the theory that in a market growing this fast, owning capacity mattered more than owning cash. In the panic of 1910, the theory met a credit squeeze. Car sales dipped, GM's bills came due, and the company that had been assembled in 20 months found it owed roughly $12 million it could not immediately pay. A syndicate of Boston and New York bankers agreed to rescue General Motors with a $15 million loan, on conditions that tell you everything about how such rescues work. They took the loan at a steep discount, meaning GM received less than $13 million but owed the full $15. They took over $6 million in commissions and fees. And they took control, a 5-year voting trust with Durant off the board of the company he had built. He was 48 years old, and the bankers assumed reasonably that he was finished. What they had not priced in was that Durant did not experience losing a company the way other men did. Associates said he treated catastrophe with the same unnerving cheerfulness he brought to triumph. He left the building, and within a year he was building his counterattack, starting with a race car driver named Louis Chevrolet. The retaking of General Motors is the part of the story they should teach in every business school, because it was done in the open, with arithmetic anyone could check. Durant set up the Chevrolet Motor Company in 1911, aimed it at the low-priced market, and by 1915 it was profitable and growing fast. Then he made his move, not on GM's factories, but on its share register. GM under the bankers' trust was profitable but stingy. It paid no dividends on common stock for years, and its shareholders were restless. Durant offered them a trade that sounded almost like a joke: 5 shares of Chevrolet for 1 share of General Motors. Investors who believed in Durant, and crucially, the DuPont family, who began buying GM alongside him with gunpowder profits from the First World War, tendered their GM shares. On September 16, 1915, exactly 7 years after founding GM, Durant walked into the annual meeting with proxies and share certificates stacked in bushel baskets, by the favorite telling of the story, and announced that Chevrolet, the little company, now controlled General Motors. By 1916, he was president again. The bankers' voting trust expired, and the man they had removed was back in the chair, having pulled off the only reverse takeover of its scale in American industrial history. He was briefly one of the most admired men in the country. The second loss was already loaded, because Durant celebrated in the most Durant way imaginable. He went back to buying everything in sight. What broke him the second time was not a factory or a car. It was a share price and his refusal to let it fall. Through 1919, GM under Durant expanded at a speed that alarmed even his allies: Frigidaire, Tractor Ventures, parts firms, a 30-story headquarters in Detroit, commitments stacked on commitments. Then came the slump of 1920. Car orders collapsed, and GM stock started sliding, from around $42 in the spring toward the low teens by autumn. A modern executive issues a statement about long-term value. Durant instead decided personally to hold the price up by buying on margin every share the market wanted to sell. Through the summer and autumn of 1920, he bought on borrowed money through dozens of brokerage accounts, convinced that the decline was the work of short-selling bears raiding his company, and that he was defending the thousands of small shareholders who had followed him. By November, He was carrying millions of shares he could not pay for. When the DuPonts and the House of Morgan finally audited the wreckage, Durant's personal obligations came to roughly $34 million, against collateral worth far less. The rescue was swift and surgical. DuPont and Morgan money paid off his brokers, took his GM shares in exchange, and took his resignation. On December 1, 1920, Durant left General Motors for the second and final time. The stake he surrendered, held to mid-century, would have been worth billions. He was reported to have kept smiling through the final meeting and to have thanked everyone in the room. The rest of the fall took 25 years, and it reads like the first act run in reverse. In 1921, he founded Durant Motors' same playbook, buy and build, a car for every purse, and for a moment it looked like a third miracle. The public subscribed tens of millions of dollars essentially on his name. But the 1920s car market was no longer 1908. Ford and a professionally managed GM had industrialized the game, and Durant Motors was dead by 1933. Durant himself had moved on to a larger casino. Through the late 20s, he ran enormous stock pools on Wall Street, was called the leading bull of the bull market, and was said at his peak to be trading positions worth over $1 billion in 1920s money. He met President Hoover in April 1929 to warn, with real insight, that the Federal Reserve's tightening would crack the market. Then he ignored his own warning and stayed long. The crash took most of what remained, the Depression took the rest. In 1936 came the bankruptcy filing, $250 in clothes. And in 1940, in Flint, the town Buick had made one of the richest working-class cities on earth. The man who founded General Motors opened a drive-in and a bowling alley called North Flint Recreation, and could be found behind the counter, 78 years old, cheerful as ever, telling reporters that bowling was the coming leisure business, and he planned a chain of 50 alleys. He was scouting the next boom to the end. A stroke in 1942 stopped it. He spent his last 5 years in a New York apartment, his bills quietly paid by a pension arranged by Alfred Sloan, and a handful of GM men who understood exactly what the company owed and preferred not to say so publicly. He died in March 1947, a few weeks before Henry Ford, whose company he had once nearly bought for $8 million. There is one more ledger to read before the verdict, and it is the one Durant himself would have skipped. What happened to the people who followed him? Every Durant venture was powered by small shareholders who bought the man rather than the balance sheet. Flint shopkeepers who put their savings into Buick because they had watched the factories rise from their own streets. Clerks and dentists who subscribed to Durant Motors in 1921 purely on the magic of the name, and the thousands of small investors he genuinely believed he was protecting when he threw his fortune against the falling GM price in 1920. Some of them did extraordinarily well. A Flint schoolteacher named Anna Dort, the widow of his old Carriage Partners associate, became a local legend for holding her early Buick-era shares through every panic. Families who kept their General Motors stock through the banker's trust, and the DuPont era were carried into genuine wealth by the company's long rise. But the ones who followed him out of GM and into Durant Motors, or into the stock pools of the late 20s, were wiped out alongside him, and they had no Alfred Sloan to arrange a quiet pension. Flint itself tells the same double story. The city Durant's companies built swelled from 13,000 people to 150,000 in 3 decades, with some of the highest working-class wages on earth. And when the Depression came, the same concentration that made it rich made it desperate, and it was Flint's workers, in the great sit-down strike of 1936 and 1937, who occupied the plants Durant had assembled and forced General Motors to recognize their union. The company that would not pay its founder a public pension was persuaded, by men sitting down inside his factories, to start paying everyone else properly. Durant, by then bankrupt in New York, took no side that anyone recorded. The town and the man had made each other, and neither could save the other when the arithmetic turned. So what actually broke William Durant twice, while lesser builders kept their fortunes? Both times, the instrument was leverage meeting a downturn, borrowed money, and commitments that only stayed safe if the line on the chart kept rising. But the mechanism underneath was something colder, the difference between creating a thing and controlling it. Durant could conjure companies out of nothing. General Motors was assembled faster than most firms can complete a merger today. But control belongs to whoever holds the claims when the music stops: the lender, the underwriter, the holder of the margin call. In 1910, that was a banker's syndicate. In 1920, it was DuPont and Morgan. In 1929, it was his brokers. The men who ended up with General Motors, Sloan the administrator, the DuPont treasury men, never confused a rising price with a safe position, and they built the century's most powerful corporation on the frame Durant left behind. He never showed a flicker of bitterness about any of it, which may be the strangest fact in the whole story. His second wife said he simply did not believe in looking backward. It made him unbeatable in a boom and defenseless in a bust, and it means the fairest epitaph is the one the numbers write. The man died worth less than a used Chevrolet, and every Chevrolet ever sold is his monument.